of the integrated dashcam. I plugged the tiny square into my laptop, expecting to see a careless driver with a shopping cart. Instead, the screen remained dark, but the cabin audio began to play with crystal clarity. The doors slammed shut on the recording. I heard the unmistakable rustle of clothing and heavy breathing. Then I heard Cameron let out a low, satisfied laugh. It was a sound that made my blood run instantly cold. Cynthia chimed in, her voice breathless and giddy, sounding decades younger than the woman who slept beside me every night. My hands hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed not by sorrow, but by a profound, chilling shock. They were not just having a sordid affair inside the very vehicle I paid for. They were conducting a hostile takeover of my life. The audio continued rolling, capturing every word, as Cameron pulled the car out of the parking garage. He complained about his software company burning through its last round of funding. He needed capital immediately, or the servers would be shut down by the end of the month. Cynthia told him not to worry. She stroked his ego, calling him a visionary, and then she casually outlined her plan to bleed my logistics company dry. She explained that with my retirement approaching, she had already begun moving money around. She referred to me as a tired old workhorse ready to be put out to pasture. She laughed as she told Cameron that once the divorce was filed, she would take half of the empire and funnel millions directly into his failing tech venture. They mocked my early mornings. They mocked the calluses on my hands. They joked about how easy it would be to blindside me because I was too busy watching shipping manifests to watch my own wife. Most men would have stormed into the house. Most men would have dragged their wife out by the wrist and demanded an explanation. They would have called their daughter, shattered her heart, and caused a massive chaotic scene. I am not most men. Tears and screaming are the weapons of the weak. I deal in freight weights, fuel costs, and cold hard logistics. The moment I heard Cynthia call me a workhorse, the love I held for her as for 30 years evaporated completely. It was not replaced by rage. It was replaced by absolute, calculating clarity. The social contract was broken. She was no longer my partner. She was a liability that needed to be liquidated. I did not go inside the house. I smoothly ejected the memory card from the laptop and slipped it into my breast pocket. I put the SUV in reverse and backed out of the garage, the tires crunching softly on the gravel driveway. I drove straight past the country club where Cynthia was supposedly having lunch with her friends. I drove past the glass office building where Cameron was playing CEO with other people's money. I headed out to the industrial district on the edge of the city, where the air smelled of diesel exhaust and hot asphalt. I own a private off-the-grid server farm nestled inside an unmarked concrete warehouse. It is the central nervous system for my logistics routing software, entirely separate from my corporate headquarters. I parked in the loading dock and used my master keycard to enter the climate-controlled server room. The hum of the cooling fans was the only sound. I sat down at the primary terminal and mounted the dashcam memory card. I created 3 separate encrypted digital backups of the audio file, storing them on separate physical drives, locked behind firewalls that Cameron's amateur tech developers could never dream of breaching. I then took the original physical memory card, walked over to the reinforced wall, and locked it inside a biometric steel safe that only opens to my fingerprint. The evidence was secured. With the weapon safely holstered, I initiated the second phase of my silent adjustment. I did not call a divorce lawyer. A divorce lawyer would simply argue over splitting the pie. I needed to ensure there was no pie left for her to take. I picked up the landline in the server room and dialed the direct number of my private forensic accountant. He is a man who operates entirely in the shadows, untangling corporate structures for multinational conglomerates. I bypassed any greetings or small talk. I gave him a single terrifying mandate. I ordered a total forensic audit of my own marriage. I instructed him to tear apart 30 years of joint bank accounts, real estate deeds, trust funds, and wire transfers. I needed every single penny Cynthia had touched over the last 5 years, tracked down to the microscopic level. I knew she had been quietly leveraging our joint properties to find anonymous seed money for Cameron, But I needed the exact paper trail. I needed to know exactly which shell companies she used and which banks she defrauded to do it. The accountant asked no questions. He simply requested 48 hours to compile the preliminary dossiers. I hung up the phone and looked around the cold concrete room. I had a narrow window of opportunity. In exactly 2 weeks, Cynthia and I were scheduled to attend a mandatory family Sunday dinner. I knew she was planning to solidify her exit strategy shortly after that event. I had 14 days of feigned ignorance. 14 days to return to that sprawling house, sleep in the same bed with the woman who betrayed me, and smile over my morning coffee. I would use every single second of that time to weaponize their greed against them. I was going to legally restructure my entire logistics company into an impenetrable fortress and replace the liquid wealth she coveted with toxic corporate debt. By the time she filed the paperwork, she would not be stealing my fortune. She would be signing her own financial death warrant. I walked out of the warehouse, stepped back into the SUV, and drove home to play the perfect, clueless husband. 48 hours, exactly, after my visit to the server farm, my private line rang. My forensic accountant did not ask how I was sleeping. He simply told me to meet him at an industrial park on the south side of town. I parked my car next to his nondescript sedan and slid into the passenger seat. He handed me a manila folder thicker than a phone book. It was the complete autopsy of my marriage. I opened the file and stared at the numbers. Cynthia had not just been siphoning loose cash to buy expensive clothes or fund secret vacations. She had executed a highly sophisticated financial extraction. Over the past 18 months, she had quietly leveraged 3 of our jointly owned commercial properties. She had targeted the logistics warehouse on 9th Avenue, the corporate office park near the river, and the downtown distribution hub. She forged my signature on secondary loan applications, exploiting the blind trust of our longtime banking partners, who simply assumed she was acting on my behalf. She funneled over $2 million into a series of anonymous shell companies registered in Nevada. The accountant traced the digital footprints from those shell companies directly into the operating accounts of Cameron and his failing software startup. She was literally dismantling the bricks of my legacy to pave a runway for her young lover. My wife was not just a cheat, she was a white-collar criminal operating under my own roof. I asked the accountant what would happen if I handed this folder to a judge tomorrow morning. His answer was the exact reason I hired him instead of a traditional family lawyer. He explained that our state operates under strict community property laws. Even with irrefutable proof of her infidelity, the court would likely force a standard division of assets. Because she was clever enough to funnel the money through corporate entities rather than personal accounts, the judge would view the $2 million as a joint bad investment rather than outright theft. If I filed for divorce immediately, I would still lose exactly half of my logistics empire, half of my fleet, and half of my remaining liquid capital. Cynthia and Cameron would walk away bruised but ultimately victorious with enough of my money to live comfortably for decades, while I spent my golden years rebuilding from the ashes. I closed the manila folder. I told the accountant I refused to let them take a single dime of the empire I built with my own hands. I needed a mechanism to make my wealth completely evaporate on paper while retaining absolute control in reality. The accountant smiled for the first time. He introduced me to the concept of the Delaware Holding Trust. Delaware corporate law is a fortress designed to protect assets from marital disputes and civil litigation. We had exactly 12 days left before the mandatory family dinner. I used every single hour of that window to execute a massive invisible restructuring of my entire life. I instructed my corporate legal team to draft the incorporation documents for a new entity named Vanguard Logistics Holdings. I did not list myself as the primary beneficiary. Instead, I structured it as a blind trust completely insulated from my personal estate. I appointed a ruthless corporate law firm in Wilmington to act as the sole trustee. Over the next week, I systematically transferred the titles of my entire fleet of 300 delivery trucks, my regional distribution centers, and my primary vendor contracts into this new, impenetrable fortress. To the outside world, my company looked exactly the same. The trucks still bore my name. The employees still received their paychecks. But legally, I no longer owned any of it. I was merely a salaried manager operating an asset that belonged to an untouchable trust. Transferring the assets was only the shield. I needed a sword. If Cynthia wanted half of my estate, she was going to get exactly what she asked for. I worked with private lenders who specialized in high-risk corporate debt. I took out massive predatory loans against the remaining liquid assets in our joint marital accounts. I borrowed millions of dollars using the commercial properties she had already compromised as collateral. These were mezzanine loans with vicious interest rates and immediate clawback provisions. I took all of this newly acquired cash and legally buried it deep inside the Delaware Trust, where no divorce court could ever reach it. I replaced my actual wealth with an enormous mountain of toxic liability. I carefully anchored this new debt to the exact Nevada shell companies Cynthia had created. By the time my legal team finished the paperwork, my personal net worth on paper had plummeted from $50 million into the negative. I was creating a financial black hole. Executing this complex financial maneuver required absolute secrecy. Every evening I had to return to the sprawling estate and play the role of the tired, aging husband. I would walk through the front door, take off my coat, and greet the woman who was actively trying to destroy me. Cynthia would pour me a glass of scotch and ask about my day. She wore a look of practiced sympathy, completely unaware that she was serving drinks to her own executioner. I told her about fictitious supply chain issues and complained about union negotiations. I watched her eyes glaze over with boredom, masking her underlying anticipation of my downfall. On the 5th night of my 14-day window, Cameron actually had the audacity to stop by the house unannounced. He stood in my kitchen drinking my coffee and complaining about the stress of running a tech company. He looked me right in the eye and thanked me for being such a supportive father-in-law. I had to suppress the overwhelming urge to shatter the coffee mug across his jaw. Instead, I patted him on the shoulder and told him that hard work always pays off in the end. I watched Cynthia smile at him from across the marble island, sharing a secret knowing glance. The days bled together in a blur of forged smiles and relentless legal maneuvering. I stopped sleeping entirely. I spent my nights in my home office reviewing the trust documents by the light of my desk lamp, while Cynthia slept soundly down the hall. I memorized every clause, every penalty, and every loophole my lawyers had crafted. I was weaving a financial noose so complex that by the time Cynthia realized it was around her neck, it would be far too late to stop the drop. On the 10th day, my accountant confirmed the final wire transfers had cleared. The Delaware Trust was fully operational and completely sealed. The marital estate was now nothing more than a hollowed-out shell packed with explosive debt. I looked at the joint bank statements that arrived in the mail that afternoon. They showed a healthy balance of liquid cash completely hiding the predatory liens I had secretly attached to them. Everything was perfectly staged to look exactly as she expected it to look. By the morning of the 14th day, the trap was fully set. I stood in my bedroom adjusting my tie in the mirror. Downstairs, the caterers were arriving to prepare for the mandatory family Sunday dinner. I could hear Cynthia giving orders to the staff, her voice sharp and authoritative. She believed she was the queen of a thriving empire, entirely oblivious to the fact that the castle had already been demolished around her. Today was the day Cameron would walk into my home, sit at my table, and pretend to respect me while looking at the woman he was stealing. Today was the day I would plant the final seed that would force them to spring the trap themselves. I walked down the grand staircase feeling lighter than I had in years. The grief was gone. The shock was gone. Only the cold anticipation of the slaughter remained. I was ready to hand them the shovel and watch them dig their own graves. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck 7 just as the front doorbell echoed through the empty foyer. It was Sunday evening. The mandatory family dinner was a long-standing tradition that my daughter Natalie cherished above all else. I stood alone in the formal dining room inspecting the massive mahogany table. The silver cutlery gleamed perfectly under the light of the crystal chandelier. It looked like a beautiful setting for a family celebration, but I had intentionally designed it to be a psychological slaughterhouse. I heard the heavy oak front door open and the sound of the bright voice of my daughter greeting her mother in the hallway. A moment later, Cameron strolled casually into the room. He walked with the unearned, arrogant confidence of a man who firmly believed he had outsmarted a titan. He wore a ridiculously expensive designer linen shirt that was paid for indirectly by my decades of grueling labor. He bypassed me completely without a word and walked straight to the antique crystal decanter resting on the side table. He poured himself a generous measure of my absolute rarest single malt scotch. He did not ask for my permission to drink it. He simply raised the heavy glass in my direction and offered a smug, condescending nod. I returned a perfectly polite, warm smile. My internal heart rate did not elevate a single fraction of a beat. I took my designated seat at the head of the table, quietly observing the arrogant insects that had infested my home. Natalie sat to my right, radiating pure, innocent joy. She was completely oblivious to the rotting structural foundation of her marriage and her entire family. Cynthia took her customary seat to my left, playing the practiced role of the devoted, wealthy matriarch. Cameron sat directly across the table from Cynthia, right next to his smiling wife. The private chef brought out the first course of the evening, but my appetite was entirely focused on the mechanics of the hunt. I watched the subtle, disgusting dynamics of the room play out in real time. The polished mahogany surface of the dining table was highly reflective. As I leaned forward to reach for my water glass, I noticed a slight, unnatural shift in the posture of Cameron. His left shoulder dipped just a fraction of an inch downward. Through the dark reflection on the polished wood and the subtle, rigid movement of the heavy fabric tablecloth, I knew exactly what he was doing. He had his foot fully stretched across the hidden space beneath the table, firmly pressing against the knee of my wife. He was actively and brazenly caressing his mother-in-law, while his own wife sat mere inches away, asking him innocent questions about his weekend golf game. Cynthia did not flinch or pull away. She took a delicate, elegant bite of her expensive salad and offered him a tight, suppressed, secret smile. The sheer brazen audacity of the act would have emotionally broken a lesser man. For me, it only perfectly validated my aggressive strategy. They felt completely invincible. They genuinely believed I was a blind, aging fool, surrounded by a mountain of wealth, completely unaware that the wolves were already feasting inside the fence. I let them enjoy their sickening secret thrill. It made the meat of the impending trap that much sweeter to serve. As the main course was finally cleared from the table, I decided it was the exact moment to drop the guillotine. I tapped my heavy silver knife gently against my crystal wine glass. The sharp, clear, ringing sound brought the entire table to an immediate, confused silence. Natalie looked at me with eager, bright anticipation. Cameron leaned back lazily in his chair, swirling the stolen, expensive scotch in his glass. Cynthia placed her linen napkin carefully on her lap, looking mildly annoyed by the sudden interruption of her silent flirtation. I took a slow, deliberate breath and projected a masterfully crafted tone of deep, weary relief. I announced to the table that after 30 long years of relentless corporate stress, I had finally made a definitive structural decision about my future. I looked directly into the eyes of Cynthia and told her that she was absolutely right all along. I told her that I had been working far too hard for far too long, and that it was finally time for us to stop building and start enjoying the massive fruits of my labor. The room remained completely dead silent. I let the heavy suspense hang in the air for exactly 3 calculated seconds before delivering the fatal, fabricated lie. I stated that effective at the very end of the month, I was stepping down from the logistics board entirely. I explained with great enthusiasm that I was officially liquidating my entire controlling stake in the logistics empire and converting every single corporate share into a massive, completely unprotected mutual fund. I painted a highly vivid picture of a joint marital bank account overflowing with tens of millions of dollars in highly liquid cash ready to be spent immediately on luxury international vacations and an extravagant early retirement. The involuntary physiological reaction from across the table was instantaneous and absolutely glorious to witness in person. The hand of Cameron stopped moving completely. The amber scotch inside his glass went dead still. His pupils dilated rapidly as the sheer staggering magnitude of the imaginary liquid cash washed over his greedy, desperate mind. He looked directly at Cynthia, and for a fraction of a second, his carefully constructed mask slipped off completely. His eyes screamed with raw, desperate hunger. I could practically see the gears turning in his head, calculating exactly how many millions he could easily siphon from that unprotected mutual fund to save his rapidly dying software company. Cynthia was far more practiced in her daily deception, but even she could not completely hide her physical shock. She blinked rapidly, trying to process the massive influx of new financial information. I knew exactly what was running through her treacherous, calculating head. Her entire long-term strategy had been built on slowly and quietly bleeding my commercial real estate over a period of years. Now I had just casually announced that the entire corporate vault was about to be unlocked and poured directly onto the living room floor. But there was a massive catch that I knew her greedy mind would instantly recognize. If I put all that money into a liquid mutual fund and actually started spending it on the extravagant retirement lifestyle I was currently describing, the pile of gold would immediately begin to shrink. She could not possibly allow that to happen. She needed to secure the total capital before I had the chance to touch a single penny of it. She needed to legally freeze the marital assets while the imaginary number was at its absolute peak. She offered a visibly trembling fake smile and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. She told me loudly that she was so proud of me and that it was the smartest financial decision I had ever made in my life. Her physical touch felt like cold, toxic venom on my skin, but I squeezed her hand back warmly and thanked her for her decades of unwavering support. The remainder of the evening was a masterclass in suffocating tension. Cameron could barely contain his manic, nervous energy. He practically dragged Natalie out of the front door the very moment dessert was finished, desperate to be completely alone so he could immediately contact his mistress and coordinate their legal attack. Cynthia excused herself to the upstairs master bedroom early, complaining of a sudden, severe migraine headache. I knew perfectly well she was not going to sleep. She was going upstairs to pace the floor and make a frantic late-night phone call to her aggressive divorce attorney. I sat completely alone in the formal dining room, finishing my glass of red wine in the quiet house. The poisoned bait had been swallowed whole by the parasites. I did not need to wait very long for the financial venom to take its full effect. The very next morning, at exactly 15 minutes past 9, the front doorbell rang loudly. I opened the heavy door to find a nervous-looking legal process server standing on my porch. He quickly handed me a thick manila envelope and practically ran back to his vehicle. I did not even need to open the seal to know exactly what was printed inside the documents. Cynthia had filed for an immediate hostile divorce, citing irreconcilable differences and demanding an emergency legal freeze on all joint marital assets to prevent me from hiding the massive mutual fund I had completely invented the night before. She had moved with predictable, desperate speed to secure the imaginary cash before I could spend it. She had absolutely no idea that by rushing to file those specific papers, she had just legally locked herself inside a burning building with no exits. The air conditioning in the downtown high-rise was set to freezing, but I felt perfectly comfortable in my tailored charcoal suit. My corporate attorney walked silently beside me, carrying a single thin leather briefcase. We stepped out of the private elevator and entered the glass-walled conference room of the most expensive and aggressive family law firm in the city. The heavy oak door closed behind us, sealing us inside the financial slaughterhouse. Cynthia was already seated at the far end of the massive, polished marble table. She was dressed meticulously for the specific theatrical part she was playing today. She wore a simple, modest gray dress, completely devoid of her usual expensive diamond jewelry. She held a crumpled tissue in her trembling hand periodically dabbing at perfectly dry eyes. Sitting right next to her was Wallace. He was a notorious divorce shark known throughout the state for financially gutting wealthy businessmen and leaving them bankrupt. He wore a smug, aggressive expression, clearly eager to initiate a brutal screaming match. He thought he was about to hunt a wounded, tired old animal. He had absolutely no idea he was walking blindly into a devastating corporate trap. We took our designated seats across the marble table. Wallace did not offer to shake my hand or exchange pleasantries. He immediately slid a thick stack of legally bound papers across the cold, reflective surface. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and launched into a highly rehearsed theatrical speech. He stated clearly and loudly that his client had suffered 3 decades of severe emotional neglect and extreme isolation due to my obsessive focus on building the logistics empire. He painted a tragic, beautiful story, claiming that while I was out building a massive fortune, Cynthia was trapped in a loveless, cold marriage, acting as a mere unpaid caretaker for my ambition. It was a masterful performance, completely omitting the hidden reality where she was currently sleeping with my son-in-law and funneling my hard-earned money into his failing software startup. Wallace then tapped his heavy, expensive gold pen directly on the front page of the settlement document. He declared that in light of my recent verbal commitment to liquidate my corporate shares into a massive, unprotected mutual fund, Cynthia was legally demanding exactly 65% of the total marital estate. He emphasized the liquid cash repeatedly. He wanted 65% of the tens of millions of dollars I had completely fabricated at the Sunday dinner. Cynthia looked down at the table, continuing to play the terrified, intimidated wife. She let out a small, pathetic sniffle to punctuate the demands of her lawyer. Wallace stared at me with predatory eyes. He told me that if I decided to fight this specific demand, he would personally drag my name through a horrific public trial. He threatened to aggressively subpoena my private company records and expose my supposed financial negligence to my entire board of directors. He firmly believed the threat of public humiliation and corporate scandal would instantly break my resolve. I sat perfectly still, letting his empty threats wash over me like useless rain on solid concrete. I looked directly at Cynthia. I saw the tiny rapid twitch at the corner of her mouth. She was desperately suppressing a triumphant smile. She genuinely believed she had successfully cornered me. She believed her aggressive, preemptive legal strike had completely neutralized my ability to protect my life's work. I pulled the thick legal document toward me. I opened the heavy cover page and slowly ran my eyes over the standard boilerplate language. My corporate attorney sat silently beside me, completely motionless. We had prepared extensively for this exact scenario. In fact, we had carefully orchestrated every single step of it. 2 days prior, my attorney had engaged in a routine exchange of preliminary legal drafts with the office of Wallace. During that totally mundane exchange of digital files, my legal team had embedded a highly specific microscopic addendum buried deep within the preamble definition of the marital estate. It was written in dense, impenetrable corporate legalese deliberately designed to make aggressive family divorce lawyers skip right over it in their eager rush to get to the financial numbers. The clause simply redefined the marital estate to explicitly include all current undisclosed liabilities and mezzanine debt anchored to any corporate entity affiliated with the primary marital residence. I reached into my suit jacket pocket and pulled out my favorite silver fountain pen. I did not ask a single question. I did not raise a single objection to the outrageous demands. I did not attempt to negotiate the staggering 65% figure down to a more reasonable number. I simply uncapped the pen and pressed the sharp nib against the heavy paper. The scratching sound of my rapid signature echoed loudly in the totally silent room. I signed the first page without hesitation. I flipped to the financial distribution agreement and signed the second page. I turned to the final binding legal resolution and signed my name for the third time. I capped the pen, placed it calmly back into my pocket, and slid the fully signed documents directly back across the marble table to Wallace. The resulting reaction was absolute stunned silence. Wallace stared down at the fresh ink signatures, as if they were written in an alien language. His jaw actually dropped open. He had heavily prepared for a bitter, grueling negotiation that would last for months and generate hundreds of thousands of dollars in billable hours for his law firm. Instead, I had surrendered the entire kingdom in less than 4 minutes. Cynthia dropped the crumpled tissue onto her lap. Her carefully crafted facade of the weeping victim instantly vanished, replaced by profound confusion and panic. She looked wildly at Wallace, demanding silent confirmation that they had actually just won the war. Wallace flipped frantically through the signed pages, checking the ink to ensure I had not used some sort of disappearing trick. He looked up at me, completely disarmed and utterly confused. He asked me directly why I was not fighting to protect the massive mutual fund cash. I looked him dead in the eye and offered a warm, gentle smile. I told him that Cynthia deserved exactly what she had earned after all these years of hard work. I stood up slowly from the marble table and buttoned my suit jacket. My attorney gathered his thin briefcase and stood right beside me. I politely wished them both a wonderful afternoon and walked out of the freezing glass-walled room. I did not look back as the heavy door clicked shut behind me. If I had stayed a single moment longer, I might have burst into loud laughter. They were sitting in that room, quietly celebrating what they believed was a lottery win of liquid millions. They were completely unaware of the invisible radioactive bomb I had just handed them. By signing that specific document, Cynthia had not just secured 65% of the marital assets. She had legally and permanently bound herself to 65% of the massive toxic debt I had secretly taken out against our properties. Because the Delaware Holding Trust had completely absorbed all my actual wealth, the only things remaining in the marital estate were her empty shell companies and the millions of dollars in predatory mezzanine loans I had attached to them. Wallace was a divorce lawyer, not a corporate forensic auditor. He only looked for hidden cash to steal. He never thought to look for artificially manufactured debt. Cynthia thought she had just become an independent millionaire, fully capable of funding the tech startup of her young lover. In reality, she had just legally accepted personal responsibility for over $4 million in immediate, unforgivable corporate liability. The financial clock was already ticking, and the private lenders I had used were not the kind of men who accepted apologies or payment plans. The silent adjustment was no longer just a strategic plan. It was now a binding legal contract. 3 days passed since the ink dried on the legal slaughterhouse agreement. It was a Tuesday morning. The air in the city was crisp and clear, but inside the expensive leased office of my son-in-law, the atmosphere was thick with blind arrogance. Cameron stood in his private glass-walled office looking out over the open floor plan of his software startup. He watched his employees playing ping-pong and drinking expensive organic coffee. He genuinely believed he was a titan of industry. He wore a custom-tailored suit and practiced his power poses in the reflection of the glass. Today was the most critical day of his entirely fabricated professional life. He was scheduled to close his Series B funding round. A massive venture capital firm from Silicon Valley was sending their lead partners to our city to inject $10 million into his failing company. There was only one mandatory condition for the venture capital firm to release the funds. Cameron had to prove he possessed $2 million in liquid operational capital to match their initial investment. He was completely unconcerned. He firmly believed the money was safely resting inside the anonymous Nevada shell company controlled by Cynthia. He thought my supposed millions were already flowing into his hands. At exactly 9 in the morning, Cameron sat down at his sleek imported desk to execute the routine wire transfer. He needed to move the $2 million from the shell company directly into his primary corporate operating account before the venture capitalists arrived at 10. He logged into the secure banking portal with a smug smile on his face. He typed in the routing numbers and the authorization codes Cynthia had eagerly provided to him. He clicked the button to initiate the transfer. He leaned back in his leather chair, expecting to see the confirmation screen. Instead, the portal refreshed and displayed a glaring red error message. The screen read, "Transaction denied due to account freeze." Cameron scoffed out loud, assuming it was a simple automated security measure or a minor technical glitch. He refreshed the page and tried again. The same red text appeared. "Access denied." A cold, tiny drop of sweat formed at the base of his neck. He picked up his phone and dialed the direct private line of the senior commercial banker who managed the shell company accounts. Cameron expected the banker to answer with his usual obsequious tone. He expected apologies and immediate technical support. Instead, the banker answered the phone with a voice made of absolute ice. Cameron demanded to know why the wire transfer was blocked and ordered the banker to release the funds immediately. The banker did not apologize. The banker calmly informed Cameron that the funds were no longer available. Cameron raised his voice, insisting there were millions of dollars in that specific account just 48 hours ago. The banker confirmed that the money had indeed been there, but it was now legally seized by a consortium of aggressive mezzanine lenders. Cameron demanded an explanation, completely failing to comprehend the reality of his situation. The banker explained the brutal mechanics of the corporate clawback clause I had engineered. The banker detailed how the Nevada Shell Company was legally tethered to the marital estate of Cynthia. When Cynthia gleefully signed the divorce settlement, assuming 65% of the estate, she also legally assumed the massive toxic corporate debt I had anchored to those exact assets. The predatory loans I had secretly taken out contained a highly specific trigger warning. Any sudden transfer of asset ownership immediately activated a default covenant. The moment Wallace filed the signed divorce papers with the court, the lenders were legally notified of the ownership transfer. The lenders instantly exercised their right to claw back their capital. At midnight, while Cameron and Cynthia were sleeping, the lenders placed an impenetrable federal lien on every single account associated with the shell company. They swept the $2 million clean to cover the first installment of the toxic debt. The banker finished the explanation by informing Cameron that not only was the account completely empty, but the shell company was now hundreds of thousands of dollars overdrawn in penalty fees. The banker abruptly ended the call. Cameron sat frozen in his leather chair, holding the dead phone against his ear. The color completely drained from his face. The digital clock on his desk flipped to 9:30. He had exactly 30 minutes before the venture capitalists walked into his boardroom, expecting to see proof of matching funds. His entire software empire was built on a foundation of stolen sand, and the tide had just rushed in. He frantically logged into his personal banking accounts, desperately searching for any available credit. He checked his personal credit cards, his secondary business lines, and even his home equity line of credit. Everything was maxed out. He had spent the last 2 years living a lifestyle of extreme luxury, funded entirely by the money Cynthia stole from my commercial properties. He had absolutely zero personal wealth to fall back on. He was completely insolvent. At exactly 10 in the morning, the receptionist escorted the 3 lead investors into the glass conference room. Cameron walked out of his office, sweating profusely through his expensive, tailored suit. He tried to project confidence, but his hands were visibly shaking. He greeted the investors with a forced, frantic energy. The lead investor was a ruthless veteran of the tech industry. She did not want to hear his practiced sales pitch or look at his colorful presentation slides. She opened her briefcase, pulled out a legal pad, and immediately demanded the certified bank statements proving the $2 million matching capital was secured. Cameron attempted to stall. He launched into a desperate, rambling speech about delayed wire transfers and minor banking compliance issues. He promised the funds would be available by the end of the week. The lead investor stopped him mid-sentence. She did not tolerate incompetence or lies. She picked up her phone and stepped out of the conference room to make a single call to her own financial analysts. It took her team exactly 4 minutes to run a background check on the Nevada Shell Company Cameron had listed as his primary guarantor. She walked back into the conference room and stared at Cameron with utter disgust. She informed him that her analysts had just discovered a massive active federal lien on his supposed guarantor. She knew instantly that he was completely broke and legally compromised. She did not yell or cause a scene. She simply packed her legal pad back into her briefcase. She told Cameron that he was a financial liability and a fraud. The three investors walked out of the glass boardroom and left the building without looking back. The entire Series B funding round was completely dead. The collapse of his empire happened with terrifying speed. It was barely noon, and the contagion was already spreading through the open office floor. The investors pulling out triggered an automatic alert to his primary payroll processor. Because his operational accounts were tied to the now frozen credit lines, the payroll company immediately suspended his account to protect themselves from liability. Today happened to be the 15th of the month. It was payday. At 12:15, the employees began checking their bank apps on their phones. The expected direct deposits were missing. Whispers started at the ping-pong tables and quickly spread to the coding desks. The organic coffee suddenly tasted bitter. The young developers and designers realized the company was out of money. Cameron locked himself inside his private office and closed the blinds. He could hear the rising panic outside his door. His senior engineers were already packing their personal belongings into cardboard boxes. They knew that a tech startup missing a payroll cycle was a fatal death sentence. There would be no recovery. Cameron sat on his expensive imported rug, holding his head in his hands. His arrogant delusions of becoming a billionaire tech mogul had been surgically eradicated in less than 4 hours. He had no money. He had no company. He had no investors. He was personally legally responsible for a massive commercial office lease he could no longer afford. The crushing weight of absolute ruin finally landed squarely on his shoulders. He needed to find a way to survive. He needed someone to save him. He reached for his phone with trembling fingers to call the only person he believed still had access to millions of dollars. He dialed the number of the woman whose greed had just destroyed them both. While Cameron sat weeping on his office floor, I was sitting comfortably in my private server room miles away. My forensic accountant sent me a single encrypted text message containing only 2 words. Execution confirmed. I set my phone down and took a sip of my black coffee. The first parasite had been successfully starved of oxygen. The silent adjustment was functioning flawlessly. Now it was time to watch the starving parasites turn on each other. I had formally vacated the marital estate exactly 24 hours after the divorce papers were signed and filed. I packed 3 modest suitcases of personal clothing and left the heavy brass keys resting neatly on the polished marble kitchen island. I relocated in complete silence to a highly secure corporate apartment downtown. Cynthia naturally interpreted my quiet departure as the ultimate retreat of a defeated, broken man. She firmly believed the sprawling mansion in the hills was now entirely her permanent sovereign territory. It was a truly magnificent property. I had spent 8 long years perfectly landscaping the massive gardens and custom building the infinity pool that overlooked the entire valley below. To Cynthia, it was no longer just a home. It was a giant, undeniable trophy proving to the world that she had successfully outsmarted me and won the ultimate prize. She wasted absolutely no time attempting to completely erase my entire existence from the property. Through the hidden network of high-definition security cameras, I had quietly left active on the perimeter. I watched her arrive on a bright Thursday morning. She did not arrive alone. She pulled up the long, sweeping gravel driveway in her luxury sedan, followed closely by 3 large commercial vans belonging to the most expensive residential architecture and design firm in the entire city. She was wearing a pristine white designer suit, holding a thick leather portfolio packed with ambitious renovation plans. She fully intended to completely gut the entire first floor, tearing down the load-bearing walls I had built to create a massive open-concept entertainment space for her and her young lover, Cameron. She stepped out of her car with the highly arrogant posture of a victorious queen, ready to survey her newly conquered kingdom. The lead architect eagerly stepped out of his van, holding heavy books of color swatches and digital measuring lasers, completely ready to indulge her every expensive whim. They walked confidently up the wide brick pathway toward the massive double oak front doors. Cynthia reached into her designer handbag to retrieve the heavy brass keys I had left for her. As she approached the top of the grand sweeping staircase, her confident stride suddenly faltered and stopped completely. She stared at the front entrance in total, utter disbelief. A heavy industrial steel chain was wrapped tightly around the custom brass handles, secured by a massive solid titanium padlock. Taped directly to the beautiful polished wood of the door was a glaring bright orange legal notice printed on heavy waterproof cardstock. The expensive architects and contractors stopped right behind her, whispering to each other in confused, hushed tones. Cynthia immediately turned bright red with furious indignation. I am certain she instantly assumed I was playing a petty, childish game, trying to illegally lock her out of her own newly won property out of sheer bitter jealousy. She turned around, ready to scream at the contractors, to fetch heavy bolt cutters from their vans. But before she could even open her mouth to speak, a man stepped out from the deep shade of the large oak tree near the garage. He was not a private security guard, and he was certainly not one of my corporate employees. He wore a sharp, perfectly tailored gray suit and carried a thick, black leather briefcase. He walked calmly toward Cynthia, introducing himself with a voice completely devoid of any emotion or sympathy. He was a senior asset recovery agent representing the private consortium of mezzanine lenders. He was the man personally tasked with collecting the toxic debt she had so eagerly accepted in the boardroom. The agent politely asked the contractors to step back to their vehicles, stating clearly that this was a private legal matter concerning the immediate total foreclosure of the property. Cynthia let out a sharp, loud laugh of sheer aggressive disbelief. She told the man he was completely insane and demanded he remove the heavy chains immediately. She proudly announced to the entire driveway that she was the sole legal owner of the estate, having just won it in a highly publicized divorce settlement. She threatened to call the police and have him arrested on the spot for criminal trespassing on her private land. The recovery agent did not flinch or react to her screaming. He did not raise his voice a single fraction. He simply opened his briefcase and pulled out a certified copy of the exact same divorce settlement she had signed just a few days prior. He politely pointed his finger directly to the microscopic legal addendum buried deep within the preamble. He then pulled out the master property deed to the estate. He explained the brutal financial reality of her current situation with absolute surgical precision. He told her that prior to the divorce, the entire mansion had been heavily leveraged as direct collateral to secure massive commercial loans for her anonymous Nevada shell companies. He explained that in our state, real estate law allows private lenders to attach absolute undeniable liens to a primary residence if the funds are used to prop up corporate entities owned by the primary occupants. When she happily signed the divorce papers claiming 65% of all assets and liabilities, she legally transferred the title of the house entirely into her own name. That specific legal transfer of ownership immediately triggered a severe default covenant written into the commercial loan agreement. The agent continued his cold, relentless explanation while the contractors watched silently from a safe distance. He informed Cynthia that because her shell companies were already completely overdrawn and fully insolvent, the lenders were legally exercising their immediate right to seize the physical collateral to cover the outstanding millions. The bright orange paper taped to the door was not a friendly warning or a request for a meeting. It was a formal, non-negotiable notice of immediate eviction and total property seizure. Cynthia stood frozen on the top step, her face turning a sickly shade of pale gray. She stammered desperately, trying to explain to the agent that the house was worth millions of dollars and that she owned the vast majority of the equity. The agent shook his head slowly. He handed her the final sheet of paper showing the current updated amortization schedule. He explained that the predatory commercial loans carried staggering daily penalty interest rates. The total debt permanently anchored to the property now vastly exceeded the actual market value of the mansion itself. There was absolutely no equity left to claim or borrow against. The house was completely and hopelessly underwater. She did not own a beautiful multi-million-dollar estate. She legally owned 65% of a catastrophic negative equity nightmare. The agent advised her that the bank would be putting the house up for public auction by the very end of the month, and she would remain personally liable for the massive financial difference between the final auction sale price and the total toxic debt. He then politely but firmly asked her to vacate the bank-owned premises immediately, or he would be legally forced to call the local authorities to have her physically escorted off the grounds for criminal trespassing. I watched the entire devastating scene unfold through the high-definition lenses of the security cameras safely sitting behind my desk in my downtown office. I watched the profound, arrogant confidence completely drain out of her body, leaving behind nothing but pure, terrified panic. The expensive architect, quickly realizing there was absolutely no money to be made and no house left to renovate, subtly signaled his work crew. They climbed back into their large commercial vans and quietly reversed down the long driveway, abandoning her entirely on the front steps. Cynthia was left standing completely alone in the bright morning sunlight, gripping her utterly useless leather portfolio of expensive renovation plans. She stared blankly at the heavy steel chains, locking her permanently out of the castle she had burned her entire life to the ground to steal. She reached out with a shaking hand and touched the bright orange eviction notice, as if simply touching it would somehow make it disappear. Her legs finally gave out under the crushing, suffocating weight of the reality, and she slowly sank down, sitting heavily on the bottom step of the grand entrance. She was no longer a wealthy, independent socialite preparing for a life of luxury. She was a homeless woman rapidly drowning in millions of dollars of inescapable, aggressive corporate debt. She had eagerly traded a life of absolute security and a devoted, loyal husband for a cheating amateur tech developer and a mountain of toxic liability. I reached forward and calmly clicked the mouse to turn off the security camera feed. My heart rate remained perfectly steady. The second major phase of the silent adjustment was now totally complete. The real estate trap had slammed shut flawlessly, breaking her financial spine. Now she had absolutely nowhere to sleep, no house to leverage, and absolutely no money to fight back against the storm that was still coming. Cynthia fled the foreclosed mansion in an absolute state of blind panic. She drove her luxury sedan recklessly through the heavy afternoon traffic, running 2 red lights in her desperate rush to reach the downtown commercial district. Her mind was racing, frantically, trying to process the catastrophic financial reality that had just been dropped on her doorstep. She firmly believed that despite losing the house, she still had a massive safety net. She still believed in the illusion of Cameron and his booming tech startup. She calculated that even if she had to assume millions in debt, Cameron had his company, his venture capital investors, and the $2 million she had funneled into his accounts. She planned to burst into his office, demand he liquidate his shares immediately, and use the tech money to hire a team of vicious lawyers to fight the bank and force me to pay the debt. She pulled up to his sleek office building, leaving her car parked illegally in a loading zone. She did not care about parking tickets. She only cared about absolute survival. She rode the glass elevator to the 14th floor, her breathing shallow and erratic. When the polished metal doors slid open, she expected to step into a bustling hub of young developers typing furiously on computers and drinking expensive coffee. Instead, she stepped into a completely silent graveyard. The entire open floor plan was deserted. Half-eaten lunches were left rotting on the desks. Desk drawers were pulled open and completely emptied. The ping-pong tables were pushed aside and the expensive espresso machines were turned off. The silent, empty room echoed with her high heels as she walked toward the only occupied space left on the entire floor. Cameron was sitting inside his private glass-walled office, staring blankly at the wall. Cynthia pushed the heavy glass door open and marched inside, her face streaked with ruined makeup. She did not offer him a warm, romantic greeting. She did not ask him how his critical investor meeting went. She immediately launched into a frantic, demanding tirade. She paced back and forth across his imported rug, shouting that the bank had just locked her out of her own home. She demanded that he immediately contact his board of directors and liquidate his equity. She ordered him to wire her at least $5 million by the end of the day to cover the commercial liens and secure a luxury hotel penthouse for them to live in while they fought me in court. She looked at him, expecting the confident, arrogant young visionary she had been sleeping with to rise up and save her from the ruins. Cameron did not stand up to comfort her. He did not offer her a glass of water or a reassuring embrace. He slowly lifted his head and looked at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. He stood up slowly, walked over to the heavy glass door, and locked it from the inside. He pulled the privacy blinds down with a vicious yank. The romantic illusion that had fueled their entire illicit affair evaporated in a single fraction of a second. The immense pressure of total financial ruin stripped away all of their pretentious affection, leaving nothing behind but two desperate, cornered animals. Cameron walked back to his desk and slammed his fist down on the polished wood so hard it rattled the windows. He screamed at her, asking if she was completely stupid. He demanded to know how he could possibly sign a binding legal divorce settlement without having a competent financial auditor read the microscopic print. Cynthia recoiled in shock, completely unprepared for his sudden, brutal aggression. She defended herself, yelling that she was only trying to secure the massive mutual fund, cash before I could spend it. She blamed him, insisting that he was the one who pushed her to file the emergency paperwork so he could get his hands on my money faster. Cameron laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed off the glass walls. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space. He explicitly detailed exactly what her greedy signature had accomplished. He told her that her brilliant legal maneuvering had completely triggered a massive default clause on the shell companies she created. He explained with brutal, agonizing clarity that the moment she legally accepted the marital estate, she also accepted the toxic debt, and the private lenders immediately placed a federal freeze on every single account tied to her name. He pointed a shaking finger directly at her face and told her that the $2 million she had stolen from my properties was completely gone. The investors had walked out. The payroll had bounced. His entire company was dead, and it was entirely her fault. Cynthia stood completely frozen, absorbing the devastating reality that her young, brilliant lover was actually a completely broke failure. She realized he had no money to save her. He had no secret tech fortune to tap into. He was just as bankrupt and exposed as she was. The panic inside her rapidly morphed into vicious defensive rage. She screamed that she had sacrificed her 30-year marriage and her entire reputation for a pathetic, weak loser. She insulted his intelligence, his business acumen, and his manhood. She told him he was nothing more than a cheap parasite who only got as far as he did because he was feeding off the scraps of my massive logistics empire. The verbal assault pushed Cameron entirely over the edge. His fragile, arrogant ego completely shattered under the weight of her vicious insults. He lunged forward and grabbed her by the shoulders, violently shaking her. Cynthia screamed and slapped him hard across the face, her diamond rings cutting into his cheek. Cameron reacted with blind, explosive fury. He shoved her backward with all of his physical strength. Cynthia lost her balance, her high heels catching on the thick imported rug. She fell hard backward, crashing directly into a heavy glass coffee table. The glass shattered underneath her, and she collapsed onto the floor, crying out in pain and complete despair. Cameron stood over her, breathing heavily, making absolutely no attempt to help her up. The fracture was total and absolute. They were completely destroyed. They believed they were completely alone in that locked office, screaming at each other in the privacy of their own ruin. They were completely wrong. I am a man who built a vast empire by always maintaining total situational awareness. I never leave anything to chance. For the past 3 weeks, I had employed the services of the most elite private investigator in the city. The investigator was a former military intelligence officer who specialized in corporate espionage and covert surveillance. At that exact moment, The investigator was parked inside an unmarked panel van on the top floor of a public parking garage directly across the street from the tech office building. The van was equipped with military-grade directional microphones and high-definition telephoto lenses designed to capture clear footage from miles away. The investigator had the camera completely focused on the glass walls of the private office. He captured the entire confrontation in stunning high-definition video. He recorded Cynthia pacing frantically and demanding money. He recorded Cameron locking the door and screaming in her face. Most importantly, he recorded the exact moment the argument turned physical. He captured the slap and the violent, brutal shove that sent Cynthia crashing into the glass table. The investigator sat quietly in the dark van, watching the live feed monitor. He hit the save button on his recording deck and immediately transmitted the heavily encrypted video file directly to my secure server. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing my new logistics contracts, when the notification popped up on my private monitor. I opened the file and watched the dramatic collapse of their relationship in perfectly silent high definition. I watched the woman who had betrayed me crying on the floor, surrounded by broken glass, while her young lover stood over her in a state of pathetic rage. I did not feel a single drop of pity. I simply reached for my coffee cup and took a slow, satisfying sip. This footage was not just a piece of interesting drama. It was the ultimate weapon for the next phase of the silent adjustment. I did not need to confront Cameron about his infidelity or his financial crimes. I did not need to tell my daughter Natalie that her husband was a violent, cheating parasite. I was going to let this beautiful, crystal-clear video recording do all the heavy lifting for me. I forwarded the video file to a secure holding folder on my desktop. It was finally time to introduce my innocent daughter to the brutal reality of the people she loved. I have always believed that the most profound pain should never be delivered through a gentle conversation. When you attempt to soften a devastating blow, you only insult the intelligence of the victim and prolong their agony. I loved my daughter Natalie more than anything else in this world, but I knew that sitting her down, holding her hand, and gently explaining the sickening betrayal of her husband and her mother would only create deep confusion and desperate denial. She needed to experience the absolute brutal reality with her own eyes and her own ears. She needed to swallow the unfiltered poison so her system could immediately begin manufacturing the necessary antidote. I sat at the desk in my secure corporate apartment and prepared a sleek black digital tablet. I loaded the raw audio file from my vehicle dashcam and the high-definition surveillance video captured by my private investigator just hours earlier. I sealed the tablet inside a heavy tamper-proof envelope and hired a bonded private courier. I gave the courier highly specific instructions. He was to wait in an unmarked car at the end of her suburban street and deliver the package directly into her hands the exact moment she arrived home from her shift at the pediatric clinic. Natalie parked her car in the driveway of the upscale townhouse I had helped them purchase 3 years ago. She walked up the brick pathway, expecting the comforting, mundane routine of a quiet Wednesday evening. She expected to cook dinner and ask her husband about his important investor meetings. Instead, she pushed open the front door and stepped into a scene of absolute manic chaos. Expensive designer clothes were violently scattered across the hardwood floors of the hallway. The hall closet doors were thrown wide open, with winter coats pulled off their hangers and dropped carelessly onto the rug. She walked cautiously toward the master bedroom and found Cameron in a state of complete psychological collapse. He was aggressively shoving custom-tailored suits and expensive watches into 2 large leather suitcases. He was sweating profusely, his hair disheveled, and he was breathing in rapid, shallow gasps. He did not even stop to greet his wife when she entered the room. He simply began frantically rambling about frozen bank accounts, collapsed funding rounds, and federal agents preparing international extradition warrants. He was absolutely terrified that the massive commercial fraud he had committed with her mother was about to trigger an immediate federal indictment, and he was preparing to flee the country. Natalie stood in the doorway, completely confused and deeply alarmed, trying desperately to calm the frantic, paranoid man she thought she knew. Before she could even begin to untangle his manic, senseless ramblings, the front doorbell rang with a sharp, piercing chime. Cameron actually jumped at the sudden sound, completely terrified that the authorities had already arrived to arrest him. He dropped his expensive clothes and backed away from the window. Natalie told him to stay in the bedroom and walked slowly back down the hallway to the front entrance. She opened the heavy oak door and found the private courier standing on the porch, holding the thick, black envelope. He asked for her signature, verified her identity, and handed her the package before turning and walking quickly back to his idling vehicle. Natalie closed the door and looked down at the envelope. It bore no return address, but it had a small white adhesive label with my personal corporate seal pressed into the corner. She knew immediately it was from me. She walked into the quiet kitchen, stepping away from the frantic noise of her packing husband. She tore open the heavy paper and pulled out the digital tablet. The screen instantly illuminated, displaying a single line of text I had typed specifically for her. The text simply read, "Do not look away from the truth." Directly below the text were two large digital media files waiting to be opened. Natalie pressed her trembling finger against the first file. It was the raw audio recording from my vehicle. The kitchen was completely silent as the incredibly clear voices of her husband and her mother suddenly filled the room. She heard the sickening, unmistakable sound of their illicit physical intimacy. She heard her mother laugh, that breathless, giddy tone that sounded decades younger than her actual age. She heard Cameron speaking with that smug, arrogant voice she had always defended, mocking my intelligence, and discussing the highly specific financial strategies they were going to use to gut my life savings. She stood completely frozen, leaning heavily against the cold marble kitchen counter. Her initial reaction was exactly what I had anticipated. The sheer, staggering magnitude of the double betrayal hit her like a physical strike to the chest. Hot tears immediately welled up in her eyes, and her breathing became ragged, as the two people she trusted most in the entire world casually discussed destroying her family for their own greedy amusement. The heartbreak was pure and suffocating, but the audio was only the first half of her brutal education. She wiped her wet cheeks, took a deep, shuddering breath, and bravely pressed her finger against the second file on the bright screen. The high-definition surveillance video began to play. She watched the completely silent footage of Cameron and her mother inside the glass-walled tech office captured just a few hours prior. She watched the manic pacing and the aggressive, angry shouting through the glass. She saw the total evaporation of their fake romantic illusion, replaced entirely by the vicious, ugly desperation of two cornered thieves turning on each other like starving animals. Then she watched the exact moment Cameron completely lost control of his temper. She saw the man she slept next to every single night raise his hands and violently shove her own mother backward into the heavy glass coffee table. She watched the thick glass shatter into jagged pieces and saw her mother collapse onto the floor in obvious physical agony. She saw Cameron stand right over her injured mother, offering absolutely no help, no comfort, and no remorse. He just stared at the broken woman on the floor with pure hatred. The video ended, and the screen faded to completely black. The reflection of her face appeared in the dark glass of the tablet. The tears on the cheeks of my daughter completely stopped falling. It is a truly profound thing to watch the genetic legacy of a family activate in a moment of extreme psychological trauma. Natalie had always been the gentle, compassionate soul of our family. But underneath that warm exterior, she carried my exact DNA. The profound, crushing heartbreak she felt just moments ago did not evolve into loud hysteria or pathetic despair. It instantly crystallized into a state of absolute freezing cold rage. The warm, innocent, devoted wife completely died in that quiet kitchen, and the daughter of a ruthless corporate tactician was born directly from the ashes. She did not scream. She did not run down the hallway into the bedroom to confront him, with tears streaming down her face demanding pathetic apologies. She calmly set the black tablet down on the marble counter. She walked slowly and deliberately to the heavy, solid oak front door of the townhouse. She engaged the primary steel deadbolt, listening to the heavy metallic click. She engaged the secondary security chain lock. She then reached down and completely removed the physical brass key from the interior security cylinder, slipping it quietly into the pocket of her scrubs. She walked back down the hallway and stood perfectly still in the doorway of the master bedroom. Cameron was still frantically zipping up his heavy leather suitcases, completely oblivious to the massive psychological execution that had just taken place inside his own house. He grabbed the handles of the heavy luggage and turned toward the bedroom door, his eyes wide with blind, terrified panic. He told Natalie they needed to drive to the airport immediately before the banks completely froze his passport and the federal agents arrived at their doorstep. Natalie did not move out of the doorway. She stood perfectly rigid, completely blocking his only exit. She looked at his sweating, pathetic face with an expression of absolute, terrifying emptiness. He was no longer her confident, brilliant husband. He was a trapped, terrified rat, desperately scurrying to escape a sinking ship. She looked right into his panicked eyes and spoke with a voice so cold and quiet, it made him instantly freeze in his tracks. She told him he was not going anywhere tonight. The front door was locked, the key was gone, and the reckoning he was so desperately trying to outrun had just arrived in his own bedroom. Cynthia dragged herself out of the shattered glass in the downtown office building. She was bleeding from a shallow cut on her arm, and her expensive designer suit was completely ruined. She walked back out to the street and found her luxury sedan exactly where she had illegally parked it. A bright yellow parking ticket was pinned under the windshield wiper, but she ignored it entirely. She climbed into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and gripped the leather steering wheel. The physical pain from the violent shove was nothing compared to the burning humiliation of being discarded by the young man she had sacrificed her entire life to support. Her panic was slowly transforming into a desperate, venomous need for retaliation. She still fundamentally misunderstood the man she had been married to for 30 years. She actually believed that my financial restructuring was a clumsy act of illegal fraud that a sharp attorney could easily pierce. She reached for her phone with trembling fingers and dialed the direct private cell phone number of Wallace. Wallace was the aggressive divorce shark who had sat across the marble table and demanded 65% of my estate. Cynthia viewed him as her personal legal gladiator. She fully expected him to answer the phone with his usual smug confidence and immediately begin drafting emergency injunctions to reverse the foreclosure on the mansion. The line rang 3 times before Wallace finally picked up. Cynthia did not even bother to say hello. She immediately launched into a frantic, breathless rant. She told him about the federal liens, the frozen shell company accounts, and the bank agent chaining the doors of her home. She practically screamed into the receiver, demanding that Wallace immediately file a massive multi-million-dollar lawsuit against me for gross financial fraud and intentional misrepresentation of marital assets. She ordered him to drag me in front of a federal judge and force me to liquidate my logistics company to pay off the toxic debt. She finished her desperate screaming and waited for Wallace to formulate his aggressive legal attack. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. When Wallace finally spoke, his voice was completely unrecognizable to her. The smug, aggressive tone was entirely gone. He sounded extremely tense, cold, and completely detached. He did not offer her a single word of comfort. He did not agree to file a single piece of paper on her behalf. He simply interrupted her frantic breathing and stated clearly that he could no longer represent her in any legal capacity whatsoever. Cynthia was totally stunned. She demanded to know what he was talking about, reminding him that she was his primary client and that he had just won her a massive settlement. Wallace corrected her immediately. He explained that their professional relationship, officially and legally, concluded the exact moment the divorce settlement was signed and filed with the state court. Cynthia began to hyperventilate. She pleaded with him to take her on as a new client for the impending civil litigation. Wallace let out a heavy sigh and explained the brutal legal reality I had engineered while she was busy playing house with her young lover. He told her that exactly 24 hours after the divorce was finalized, his prestigious law firm received a highly lucrative inquiry from a major corporate entity based in Delaware. That entity was Vanguard Logistics Holdings. The trust had approached the senior partners of his firm, seeking exclusive legal representation for an upcoming series of highly complex commercial acquisitions. The trust had offered a staggering upfront retainer fee of $500,000 just to secure their consultation services for the next 12 months. The senior partners eagerly accepted the massive payment and signed the binding retainer agreements immediately. Wallace spoke slowly to ensure Cynthia understood the absolute finality of the situation. He explained that because Vanguard Logistics Holdings was the exact same corporate entity that now held the debt associated with her shell companies, his law firm was now bound by a strict and undeniable conflict of interest. The American legal rules are absolutely clear on this matter. A lawyer cannot possibly represent a client in a lawsuit against a corporation that is currently paying their own firm a massive retainer for legal counsel. Wallace told her that if he even offered her a single word of legal advice regarding her current bankruptcy crisis, he would be immediately disbarred, and his entire firm would be exposed to catastrophic civil liability. He bluntly stated that she was now legally radioactive. He ordered her never to call his private number again, and he abruptly hung up the phone. Cynthia sat in her parked car, listening to the dead tone of the disconnected call. The reality of my strategic isolation campaign was beginning to crush her chest. But I had not stopped with Wallace. A man does not build a massive corporate empire by leaving the back door unlocked. I knew that Cynthia possessed the social connections to reach out to other elite lawyers in the city. She had spent decades attending expensive country club charity dinners, shaking hands with the most powerful litigators in the state. I could not allow her to secure competent representation. In the weeks leading up to the final divorce, I had systematically mobilized my corporate legal team. We had identified the top 15 most aggressive high-net-worth litigation firms within a 200-mile radius. My team approached every single one of those elite firms under the guise of the Vanguard Logistics Trust. We offered each firm a modest but highly attractive preliminary consultation retainer of $50,000 to review potential future shipping contracts. It cost me roughly $750,000 in total liquid cash to execute this maneuver. It was the best investment I had ever made in my entire life. Every single one of those elite law firms happily accepted the easy money and signed the standard conflict of interest waivers. I had essentially bought the absolute silence of the entire high-end legal community. Cynthia frantically spent the next 3 hours sitting in her hot car, dialing every single powerful lawyer she knew. She called the men she used to play tennis with. She called the women she used to host at our dinner parties. Every single phone call ended exactly the same way. The receptionists would take her name, run a quick conflict check in their computer systems, and immediately return to the line to politely inform her that their firm was legally barred from taking her case. No one would even schedule a preliminary meeting with her. She was completely and utterly blacklisted from every top-tier firm in the city. The invisible walls of the prison I had built for her were finally closing in tight. She had absolutely no money to her name. Her accounts were frozen. Her house was gone. Her lover had violently abandoned her. And now she had absolutely no legal shield to protect her from the massive federal debt collection agencies that were already beginning to hunt her down. The toxic commercial mezzanine debt she inherited required an immediate response in federal bankruptcy court. If she failed to appear and mount a competent legal defense, the creditors would be granted the authority to garnish any future wages she ever earned and seize any personal property she ever acquired for the rest of her natural life. With no other options remaining, the woman who used to wear custom-tailored dresses and sip expensive champagne was forced to drive to the municipal legal aid clinic located in the poorest district of the city. She parked her luxury sedan, which was already scheduled for imminent bank repossession, on a dirty street corner. She walked into the crowded fluorescent-lit waiting room. She had to take a plastic numbered ticket from a red dispenser and sit in a hard plastic chair surrounded by petty criminals and destitute individuals. She sat there for 6 hours, waiting for her number to be called. When she finally sat down across from an exhausted, overworked public defender, she tried to explain the complex multi-million-dollar web of Delaware holding trusts, shell companies, and predatory mezzanine loans. The young public defender, who normally handled simple traffic violations and minor eviction cases, just stared at her with a blank, confused expression. He had absolutely no idea how to untangle the highly sophisticated corporate snare I had wrapped around her neck. He handed her a stack of standard bankruptcy forms and told her to fill them out the best she could. Cynthia walked out of the dingy legal clinic clutching the cheap paper forms. The legal evaporation was perfectly complete. I had stripped her of her wealth, her home, her lover, and her ability to fight back. She was totally defenseless, and the federal government was next in line to take their pound of flesh. Cameron was trapped inside the master bedroom, with the heavy leather suitcases completely packed, but absolutely no way to exit through the front door. Natalie stood perfectly still in the hallway, projecting an aura of absolute freezing calm that he had never seen before. He realized very quickly that the gentle, forgiving wife he had manipulated for 3 years was completely gone. In a state of blind, animalistic panic, Cameron did not even attempt to negotiate with her. He grabbed the heavy handles of his luggage and dragged them toward the rear of the townhouse. He picked up a heavy brass lamp from the bedside table and violently smashed the sliding glass patio door. The thick glass shattered outward into the dark backyard. He stepped through the broken frame, cutting his expensive leather shoes on the jagged shards, and ran into the cold night air like a terrified coward. Natalie did not chase him. She did not raise her voice. She simply watched him flee over the wooden fence, leaving him to the absolute destruction that was already waiting for him out in the world. Cameron managed to hail a passing taxi on the main avenue, dropping his heavy bags into the trunk. He ordered the driver to take him directly to the international airport. Sitting in the back seat of the cab, he pulled his laptop from his leather messenger bag. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely type his own passwords. He knew that his primary corporate accounts were completely frozen by the mezzanine lenders, but he also knew a dirty secret about his software startup. He had maintained a secondary hidden escrow account specifically designated for holding employee payroll taxes before they were remitted to the federal government. It was the only account the aggressive private lenders had not immediately located and frozen because it was registered under a slightly different corporate identification number. The account contained exactly $50,000. It was the absolute last drop of liquid cash remaining in his entire ruined empire. Cameron knew that transferring money out of a designated federal tax escrow account for personal use was a massive, severe felony. It was no longer just a civil dispute or a messy corporate bankruptcy. Stealing payroll taxes is a direct declaration of war against the United States government. But in his desperate, manic state, he calculated that if he could just get on a plane to a country without an extradition treaty, he would never have to face the consequences. He connected his laptop to the cellular hotspot on his phone. He bypassed the internal accounting protocols and initiated a direct wire transfer, moving the entire $50,000 into a digital offshore banking wallet that he could access from anywhere in the world. He watched the progress bar slowly fill on the bright screen. When the confirmation notice finally appeared, displaying a zero balance in the tax account, he let out a long, ragged breath of relief. He genuinely believed he had just secured his survival. He believed he had successfully outsmarted me one final time. The taxi pulled up to the curb of the massive international terminal. Cameron handed the driver a crumpled $100 bill and dragged his heavy luggage out onto the concrete pavement. It was approaching midnight, and the airport was relatively quiet. The bright fluorescent lights overhead made his pale, sweating face look completely sickly. He practically ran to the ticketing counter of a major foreign airline. He used his newly funded digital wallet to purchase a highly expensive first-class one-way ticket to a small island nation in the Caribbean, known for its extremely complicated extradition laws. The ticketing agent printed his boarding pass and handed it to him with a polite smile. Cameron snatched the piece of paper from her hand. For a brief fleeting moment, his old arrogant confidence returned. He looked around the massive terminal, feeling a sudden rush of superiority. He believed he was walking away from the collapsing ruins of the marital estate, leaving Cynthia to take the total financial fall while he escaped to a tropical beach with stolen money. He walked briskly toward the primary international security checkpoint. There was no line at this late hour. He approached the podium where a uniformed officer sat behind a thick plexiglass screen. Cameron handed over his boarding pass and his dark blue passport. He stood there tapping his foot impatiently, waiting for the routine scan so he could walk through the metal detectors and disappear into the luxury departure lounge. The officer swiped the passport through the digital reader. The machine did not emit the usual soft approving chime. Instead, the computer screen flashed with a bright, solid red warning banner. The officer did not look up. He did not hand the passport back. He simply pressed a hidden button underneath his desk and calmly asked Cameron to wait just one moment for a routine secondary verification. Cameron felt the cold, heavy knot of pure terror instantly return to his stomach. He demanded his passport back, claiming he was going to miss his incredibly important flight. The officer ignored him completely. Less than 30 seconds later, a heavy side door adjacent to the security checkpoint opened abruptly. Two large men wearing dark tactical clothing and heavy-duty utility belts stepped out into the open terminal. They were not local police officers, and they were certainly not standard airport security personnel. They wore dark bulletproof vests with the bright yellow letters of the federal authorities printed boldly across the chest. They were special agents from the Criminal Investigation Division of the federal government. They walked with absolute deliberate purpose directly toward Cameron. Cameron instinctively took a step backward, his eyes darting frantically toward the main exit doors. But his legs felt like lead, and he was completely paralyzed by fear. The lead agent stepped firmly into his personal space and ordered him to place his hands behind his back. The agent did not read him his rights regarding a domestic dispute or a civil divorce matter. The agent announced in a loud, clear voice that echoed across the quiet terminal that Cameron was being placed under immediate federal arrest. The charges were staggering. He was being indicted for massive wire fraud, international money laundering, and the intentional evasion and theft of federal payroll taxes. The second agent grabbed the wrists of the arrogant tech founder, pulled them forcefully behind his back, and locked heavy steel handcuffs securely into place. The sharp metallic click of the cuffs signaled the absolute total end of his miserable freedom. While Cameron was being aggressively marched through the airport terminal in front of staring passengers, I was sitting comfortably in the leather armchair of my corporate apartment, reading a novel. My personal cell phone vibrated quietly on the side table. It was a secure text message from my forensic accountant confirming that the federal hold had been successfully executed at the border. I set the phone down and smiled. Cameron truly believed that his last-minute desperate theft of the $50,000 was his own brilliant idea. He had absolutely no idea that I had been tracking that specific hidden tax account for 2 entire weeks. When I originally ordered the total forensic audit of my marriage, my accountant had unearthed every single illegal transaction Cameron and Cynthia had ever committed. I did not just keep that devastating information hidden in a file to use in divorce court. Family court is for dividing furniture. I wanted absolute total destruction. 3 days before the family Sunday dinner, I had my accountant compile a massive, incredibly detailed whistleblower package. We gathered the forged bank signatures, the fraudulent commercial loan applications, and the digital IP addresses, proving they were moving money through illegal shell companies. We packaged all of this irrefutable physical evidence and submitted it directly to the highest levels of the Federal Financial Crimes Division. The federal government moves very slowly when they are building a case, but they move with terrifying immediate speed when a primary suspect attempts to cross an international border with stolen funds. The automated flag on his passport had been active for days, just waiting for him to make a desperate run for it. His decision to steal the $50,000 in payroll taxes tonight was just the final beautiful nail in his own coffin. By taking that specific federal money, he upgraded his crimes from standard corporate fraud to a massive federal offense carrying a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in a maximum security prison. He thought he was running away from the divorce drama, but he had actually sprinted directly into a federal trap I had set for him weeks ago. The financial crimes completely superseded any domestic issues. There would be no expensive lawyers negotiating a quiet settlement. There would be no second chances or fresh starts. He was going to be locked inside a concrete federal cell, stripped of his expensive suits and his arrogant pride. The third phase of the silent adjustment was entirely complete. The young parasite had been permanently surgically removed from society. Now there was only one loose end remaining to be handled at the bankruptcy mediation table. The concrete walls of the federal detention center were painted a pale, sickly green. The room was perfectly square, featuring a single steel table bolted firmly to the heavy floor. A two-way mirror dominated the far wall, reflecting the harsh glare of the buzzing fluorescent lights overhead. Cameron sat in a hard metal chair, shivering slightly, in the over-air-conditioned room. He had been locked inside holding cell block 4 for 14 agonizing hours since his dramatic arrest at the airport. His expensive tailored suit was deeply wrinkled and stained with nervous sweat. He had not slept. He had not eaten. The arrogant tech visionary who used to swagger through my dining room drinking my expensive scotch was completely gone. He was replaced by a terrified, exhausted little boy facing the absolute crushing weight of the United States justice system. He rubbed his wrists where the heavy steel handcuffs had cut into his skin. He was waiting for his expensive criminal defense attorney to arrive. He was completely unaware that the retainer fee his lawyer demanded was sitting in a frozen bank account he could no longer access. He was entirely alone. The heavy steel door swung open with a loud metallic clatter. 2 federal agents walked into the interrogation room. They were not local detectives looking to solve a neighborhood dispute. They were veteran financial crimes investigators who spent their entire careers dismantling massive corporate fraud syndicates. They did not sit down immediately. They did not offer him a cup of coffee or ask how he was feeling. The lead agent, a tall man with a completely unreadable expression, dropped a thick manila folder directly onto the center of the steel table. The loud slapping sound made Cameron physically flinch. The agent opened the folder and began to read the formal federal charges aloud in a cold, monotonous voice. He listed the intentional evasion of corporate payroll taxes. He listed the illegal unauthorized wire transfer of $50,000 to an offshore digital wallet. He listed international money laundering and a deliberate attempt to flee federal jurisdiction. The second agent leaned over the table, placing both of his hands flat on the cold steel. He looked directly into the bloodshot eyes of Cameron and explained the mathematical reality of his current situation. The agent stated that federal sentencing guidelines are completely inflexible. There is no parole in the federal prison system. He told Cameron that with the flight risk enhancement and the sheer dollar amount of the stolen payroll taxes, he was looking at a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 solid years in a maximum security penitentiary. The agent painted a vivid, terrifying picture of what the next decade of his life would look like. 10 years wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. 10 years sleeping on a thin mattress over a steel slab. 10 years surrounded by violent career criminals. The agent finished his brutal speech by looking at his watch and stating they had plenty of other cases to process today. They offered Cameron one single extremely narrow window of opportunity to save himself. They demanded to know exactly who else was involved in the massive financial structure that funded his failing software company. I have always known that there is absolutely no honor among thieves. When a parasite is cornered and facing extermination, it will always turn its venom on its own host to survive. Cameron did not even take a deep breath to consider his options. He did not ask to speak to his non-existent lawyer. The sheer paralyzing terror of spending 10 years in a federal prison completely shattered any remaining loyalty he held for my wife. He broke immediately and violently. He leaned forward over the steel table, his voice trembling and desperate, and began to sing like a cornered rat. He completely offered Cynthia to the federal agents on a silver platter. He frantically began to weave a pathetic narrative, casting himself as the young, naive victim of a wealthy, vindictive older woman. He claimed that he was just a struggling entrepreneur trying to build a legitimate business. He told the agents that Cynthia was the true evil mastermind behind the entire financial conspiracy. Cameron rapidly explained that Cynthia hated me with a burning passion and wanted to completely destroy my logistics empire before I could retire. He claimed she was the one who forcibly leveraged the commercial properties. He insisted she was the one who set up the anonymous Nevada shell companies and funneled the stolen money into his accounts. He swore to the agents that he had absolutely no idea the initial seed money was stolen from my corporate portfolio. He painted Cynthia as a brilliant, manipulative sociopath who used her wealth and her physical seduction to trap him in a web of corporate fraud. He begged the agents for total federal immunity in exchange for his full cooperation in prosecuting her. The federal agents listened to his frantic, desperate story with completely blank expressions. They were seasoned professionals who dealt with liars every single day. The lead agent shook his head slowly. He told Cameron that pointing fingers at a bitter ex-wife in the middle of a messy divorce was not enough to secure a federal immunity deal. The agent demanded hard, irrefutable physical proof. He told Cameron that unless he could provide a paper trail proving Cynthia was a career criminal capable of masterminding this level of complex fraud, he was still going to spend the next 10 years in a concrete cell. This specific demand for physical proof pushed Cameron to reveal a completely new, deep layer of my wife's deception. He realized he needed to prove that her criminality did not just start a year ago when their affair began. He needed to prove she had a long-established history of financial fraud. Cameron swallowed hard and looked around the sterile room. He lowered his voice and revealed the dark secret Cynthia had foolishly shared with him during one of their late-night romantic hotel encounters. He told the federal agents that the commercial real estate embezzlement was not her first major crime against me. He revealed that long before she ever touched the shell companies, she had been actively cooking our personal financial books for years. Cameron explained that Cynthia possessed a massive secret addiction to luxury shopping and high-end international art auctions. She had quietly accumulated hundreds of thousands of dollars in hidden personal credit card debt. To prevent me from discovering the massive drain on our personal finances, she took absolute control of filing our joint marital tax returns. Cameron told the agents that for 3 consecutive years, Cynthia had intentionally falsified federal tax documents. She had completely fabricated massive depreciation losses on our various real estate properties to artificially lower our tax burden and secure massive illegal federal refunds. She then used those stolen federal refunds to quietly pay off her secret luxury shopping debts. Most importantly, Cameron explicitly stated that Cynthia had meticulously forged my signature on every single one of those fraudulent federal tax returns. The atmosphere in the interrogation room instantly changed. The federal agents stopped leaning on the table and stood up straight. Stealing money from a wealthy husband is a civil matter. Stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Internal Revenue Service through forged federal tax documents is a massive, severe federal felony. It is the exact kind of crime that makes entire federal agencies mobilize. The lead agent pulled out a fresh notepad. He demanded to know how Cameron could possibly prove this explosive allegation. Cameron offered a pathetic, desperate smile. He was a tech founder who fundamentally understood the value of digital blackmail. He confessed that when Cynthia first told him about the tax fraud, he realized she was incredibly dangerous. As an insurance policy, he had secretly convinced her to give him the original forged tax documents, claiming he needed them to secure better interest rates for his startup. Cameron gave the federal agents the exact physical location of his personal safety deposit box located at a private bank across town. He provided them with the secure passcode and the digital encryption keys needed to access the files. He handed them the absolute smoking gun required to destroy her life. The agents left the interrogation room immediately, leaving Cameron alone in the cold silence. Within 2 hours, a federal tactical team executed a search warrant on the bank and successfully recovered the forged tax documents. My private forensic accountant received a highly confidential phone call from a contact inside the Internal Revenue Service later that afternoon. The accountant drove directly to my corporate apartment and relayed the incredible news. The situation had beautifully escalated far beyond my original design. My calculated silent adjustment had successfully pushed them into a corner, and the immense pressure had forced them to tear each other to pieces. The illicit affair was no longer just a dirty little family secret, because they had used the affair to coordinate and hide their financial crimes. The romance itself was now officially classified as the primary motive in a massive federal conspiracy investigation. Cynthia was no longer just facing a civil bankruptcy court. She was about to be hunted down by the most ruthless and powerful financial criminal investigators in the country, all because the young man she threw her entire life away to protect had traded her freedom for a slightly more comfortable mattress in a federal prison. The crushing weight of federal scrutiny acts as a rapid corrosive acid on human relationships. Within 24 hours of Cameron offering his desperate confession to the financial crimes investigators, my former wife found herself entirely isolated from the rest of the human race. I received a brief update from my security team detailing her pathetic attempts to seek shelter. She had walked from the municipal legal aid clinic to the upscale townhouse belonging to our daughter. She stood on the front porch, ringing the doorbell repeatedly and crying into the intercom. Natalie did not open the door. Natalie did not even bother to speak through the speaker system. She simply pressed a button on her smart home application that immediately deactivated the front gate access code Cynthia had used for years. The rejection from her own flesh and blood was the final devastating blow to her fragile, constructed reality. She was officially a ghost wandering the streets of the city she used to rule from a hilltop mansion. She had no husband. She had no young lover. She had no daughter. She had absolutely no access to credit, and she was facing a massive federal indictment that would likely result in a lengthy prison sentence. The sheer paralyzing terror of her situation finally stripped away the last remaining shreds of her arrogant pride. She realized there was only one person left in the entire world who possessed the power and the financial resources to potentially stop the federal machinery from completely destroying her. She managed to scrape together enough loose cash from the bottom of her ruined designer handbag to pay for a cheap city bus ticket. She rode the crowded public transit for an hour, sitting among the exhausted working-class people she had spent her entire life mocking and avoiding. She stared blankly out the smeared glass window as the bus navigated toward the downtown financial district. She had somehow managed to acquire the address of my secure corporate apartment building, likely by begging a former socialite friend for a single favor. She stepped off the bus onto the busy concrete sidewalk. Her expensive gray dress was heavily wrinkled and stained with the dirt of the city. Her hair was unkempt and her posture was completely broken. She walked slowly toward the towering glass and steel skyscraper that housed my new private residence. She genuinely believed that if she could just see me face to face, she could deploy the exact same manipulative tears she had used to control me for 3 decades. She thought 30 years of shared history would automatically guarantee a safety net of mercy. She fundamentally failed to understand that the man she married was entirely dead, and she was now dealing strictly with the architect of her ruin. The lobby of my corporate building is a masterpiece of modern, intimidating architecture. It features soaring 30-foot ceilings, polished black marble floors, and a massive central security desk manned by former military personnel. Cynthia pushed through the heavy revolving glass doors and immediately approached the polished marble counter. She leaned heavily against the cold stone, trying to project an air of authority that she no longer possessed. She told the head concierge that she was my wife and demanded to be allowed into the private penthouse elevator immediately. The concierge did not smile. He did not reach for the telephone to call my room. He simply looked at a digital restricted access list glowing on his monitor. He informed her in a perfectly flat, professional tone that her name was permanently flagged in their security system. She was officially designated as an unauthorized hostile individual, and she was barred from passing the front desk under any circumstances. Cynthia began to weep loudly. She gripped the edge of the marble counter and begged the security guards to just let her speak to me for 5 minutes. She cried out that she was completely homeless and that the federal government was trying to put her in a concrete cage. She caused a pathetic, embarrassing scene in the pristine lobby while wealthy executives and corporate lawyers walked past her in total disgust. I was sitting comfortably in my penthouse suite sipping a glass of chilled, sparkling water. I was watching her entire mental breakdown in brilliant high definition on the secure live camera feed transmitted directly from the lobby desk. I watched her tears fall onto the polished black marble. I watched her shoulders shake with genuine, absolute despair. A small part of the old man I used to be might have felt a tiny fleeting pang of pity for the woman who bore my child. But that man was buried the moment I heard her laughing with her lover in my vehicle. I felt absolutely nothing. I did not pick up the phone to call the front desk. I certainly did not take the private elevator down to the lobby to look her in the eye. Granting her an audience would only validate her delusion that she still held some form of emotional leverage over me. True power is exercised through complete physical absence. I picked up my desk phone and pressed a single button to connect with the junior administrative office located on the second floor of the building. I spoke to a young entry-level logistics clerk named Thomas. Thomas had been working for my company for exactly 3 weeks. He was 22 years old, fresh out of a community college business program, and he was eager to prove his worth. I gave Thomas highly specific instructions. I told him to go to the Human Resources digital portal and print out a single standard employment document. I told him to place that document inside a plain manila folder, walk down to the main lobby, and hand it directly to the weeping woman making a scene at the security desk. I then gave him a precise verbal message that he was required to memorize and deliver to her without a single ounce of empathy or hesitation. Thomas confirmed the orders and hung up the phone. I leaned back in my leather chair and turned my attention back to the live security monitor to watch the final execution of her pride. Less than 5 minutes later, the elevator doors in the lobby slid open, and young Thomas stepped out onto the black marble floor. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit, but he walked with the confidence of a man acting on the direct authority of the chief executive. He approached the security desk where Cynthia was still actively sobbing into her hands. The guards stepped back, allowing the young clerk to handle the situation. Thomas held out the plain manila folder. Cynthia slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide with sudden, desperate hope. She reached out with trembling fingers and took the folder, genuinely believing it contained a massive financial settlement, a check to cover her legal fees, or perhaps the keys to a comfortable secondary house. She thought her tears had successfully penetrated my armor. She opened the folder right there in the middle of the lobby. There was no check. There were no keys. There was only a single piece of cheap white printer paper. It was a standard corporate application, for the minimum wage overnight janitorial position at my oldest, most dilapidated industrial logistics warehouse located on the dangerous south side of the city. Cynthia stared at the paper in total, uncomprehending shock. She looked up at Thomas, expecting him to explain the sick joke. Thomas stood perfectly straight and delivered my exact words with cold, robotic precision. He told her that Mr. Russell sends his absolute final regards. He instructed Thomas to inform her that this specific janitorial application is the absolute only source of legal income she will ever be permitted to access for the rest of her natural life. He told her that if she fills it out correctly, she will be granted a mop, a bucket, and the opportunity to scrub the concrete floors her former husband owns to slowly pay off the millions of dollars she currently owes him. Thomas did not wait for her response. He simply turned around and walked back toward the elevators, leaving her completely alone. Cynthia looked down at the minimum wage application. The full, crushing weight of her new reality finally snapped the last remaining pillar of her sanity. She realized I was not going to save her. I was not going to negotiate with her. I was offering her a lifetime of grueling manual labor just to survive the massive debt she had eagerly stolen from me. She dropped the folder onto the floor. She turned around and walked slowly out of the heavy glass revolving doors, disappearing into the anonymous, crowded city streets. The absolute bottom had finally been reached. She had absolutely nothing left to lose, and absolutely nowhere left to hide. I closed the security feed window on my computer monitor and went back to reviewing my quarterly profit margins. The air in my penthouse felt incredibly clean, and I had a bankruptcy mediation to prepare for. Natalie did not spend the night crying in the dark. She spent it moving with the exact same cold, mechanical precision she had watched me use my entire life. When the morning sun finally rose over the quiet suburban neighborhood, she did not call her friends for comfort or seek out a therapist to discuss her broken heart. She walked down the hallway of the empty townhouse and stood in the doorway of the pristine home office belonging to Cameron. She knew her husband was currently sitting in a federal holding cell, breathing recycled air and facing a decade in prison. She also knew that the federal agents were entirely focused on the stolen payroll taxes and the massive wire fraud. They had not yet seized his personal intellectual property because it was not directly tied to the stolen federal funds. The proprietary source code for his software startup was still sitting on the massive private servers located right inside their marital home. That specific digital code was the only thing Cameron genuinely loved in this world. He firmly believed it was his ultimate masterpiece and his permanent golden ticket. He believed that even if he went to prison, he could eventually sell that code to a rival tech firm and emerge as a wealthy man. Natalie decided to completely relieve him of that dangerous, arrogant delusion. She walked into the office and turned on the heavy overhead lights. The room was decorated with expensive framed magazine articles, praising his supposed tech genius, and sleek modern furniture paid for by the money he helped steal from her family. Cameron had always been intensely paranoid about corporate espionage from his imaginary rivals. He used complex biometric locks and encrypted passwords for his remote servers. But he was also a creature of extreme arrogant habit, and he completely underestimated the quiet, observant woman he had married. Natalie knew he kept a physical emergency backup ledger hidden inside the false bottom of his lower desk drawer. She retrieved the small black leather notebook and systematically bypassed every single security protocol he had established. As his legal wife, she possessed absolute unrestricted legal access to the marital residence and every single piece of physical property located inside of it. She was not committing a crime. She was simply managing her own household assets. She sat down at his expensive mechanical keyboard and logged directly into the primary master server hosting his entire software architecture. She did not just drag the files to the digital trash bin. A simple deletion could easily be recovered by a competent data forensic team. She opened the administrative terminal and downloaded a military-grade digital wiping utility. She commanded the system to aggressively overwrite every single line of code with random useless data strings. She set the program to repeat the overwriting process 7 consecutive times to ensure absolute permanent eradication. She sat in his expensive ergonomic leather chair and drank her morning coffee while watching the progress bar slowly crawl across the bright monitors. She watched 3 years of his arrogant labor, his late-night coding sessions, and his entire professional identity completely evaporate into useless digital garbage. When the master servers were totally wiped clean, she turned her attention to the physical hardware. Cameron kept 3 heavy external solid-state backup drives locked inside a fireproof safe in the hallway closet. She used the numeric combination he had stupidly reused from their home alarm system to easily open the heavy steel door. She carried the expensive silver drives down the hall and walked into their luxurious master bathroom. She turned on the heavy brass fixtures and filled the deep porcelain soaking tub to the absolute brim with scorching hot water. She did not smash the drives with a heavy hammer. That would be loud, messy, and emotionally unhinged. Instead, she gently dropped the 3 hard drives directly into the steaming water. She watched the tiny air bubbles rise to the surface as the internal platters completely flooded and the delicate magnetic components were permanently destroyed. The digital heart of his fake empire was now resting quietly at the bottom of a bathtub. With the intellectual property completely annihilated, Natalie moved to secure the physical perimeter of her home. She hired an emergency commercial locksmith who arrived within the hour. She had the technician completely remove every single physical brass lock cylinder on the exterior doors and replace them with heavy-duty industrial smart locks, controlled exclusively by her personal mobile device. She then directed the contractor to the back of the townhouse, where Cameron had violently smashed the sliding glass patio door during his cowardly escape. She had the contractor permanently seal the entire shattered frame from the inside with thick, heavy plywood secured by long steel screws. By noon, the townhouse was transformed into an impenetrable fortress, and the locks were completely changed. While Natalie was securing her home, Cameron was experiencing the absolute most humiliating morning of his entire life. He managed to secure a temporary release from federal custody late the next afternoon. He had begged a federal judge for leniency during his arraignment. A predatory bail bondsman had only agreed to post the massive bond after Cameron signed over the rights to his future legal defense fund, leaving him completely destitute. He walked out of the downtown detention center wearing a heavy black federal tracking monitor strapped tightly to his ankle. He was wearing the exact same wrinkled suit he had been arrested in. He was completely exhausted, terrified, and completely broke. His bank cards were entirely frozen by the government. He could not even afford to hire a cheap taxi. He was forced to walk over 3 miles from the federal courthouse to a public bus station and endure a miserable 2-hour transit ride back to the quiet suburbs. Despite his total humiliation, Cameron was holding on to a single desperate sliver of hope. He believed he could quickly run back to the townhouse, grab his physical backup drives, and quietly sell the proprietary source code to a rival tech firm for a fraction of its total value just to secure enough cash to hire a decent criminal lawyer. He walked up the familiar brick pathway of his home, his feet covered in painful blisters from his expensive leather shoes. He reached for the front door handle, expecting to walk right in. He realized immediately that the lock had been completely changed. He frantically punched his usual numeric code into the new electronic keypad. The lock flashed a bright red error light and emitted a harsh, rejecting beep. He pressed his sweating face against the front window, trying to look inside. The house was completely dark and entirely silent. Panic set in again. He ran around to the back of the townhouse, stepping over the shattered glass in the grass. He expected to easily walk right back into the master bedroom through the door he had broken. Instead, he found the shattered frame completely boarded up with thick, heavy wood. He stood in his own backyard, completely locked out. He then noticed a small plain cardboard box sitting on the edge of the wooden deck. He walked over and ripped open the taped flaps. Inside the box were the 3 external backup drives he desperately needed. They were completely soaked, heavily corroded, and dripping with stagnant water. Taped to the top drive was a single handwritten note from his wife. The note did not contain any emotional farewells or angry accusations. It simply informed him that his master servers had been permanently wiped and the physical backups were completely dead. The note concluded by stating that his clothes had been donated to a local charity and his presence was no longer required. Cameron dropped the ruined wet drives onto the wooden deck. He fell to his knees in the grass, completely realizing the absolute totality of his destruction. His company was dead. His freedom was gone. His wife had surgically removed his absolute last remaining asset. He was completely erased. 6 months is a profound measurement of time when applied to human suffering. In the corporate shipping world, 6 months is exactly 2 financial quarters. It is enough time to completely restructure a massive supply chain. In the brutal machinery of the federal justice system and civil bankruptcy courts, 6 months is exactly the amount of time required to completely crush the arrogant human spirit. I walked into the federal mediation building on a cold Tuesday morning. I was wearing a newly tailored charcoal suit and a conservative silk tie. I was flanked by two of the most expensive and ruthless corporate litigators in the entire state. We bypassed the public security lines and walked directly into the private conference rooms reserved exclusively for high-net-worth corporate dispute resolutions. Cynthia and Cameron were already seated at the cheap laminated wood table when I entered the room. The physical toll of the last 6 months was absolutely staggering to witness. Cynthia was wearing a faded gray sweater that looked like it had been pulled from a discount charity donation bin. Her hair was entirely gray at the roots, and her skin had the dull, sunken texture of someone who had survived on nothing but severe panic and cheap instant coffee. Cameron looked significantly worse. He was wearing a terrible polyester suit that hung loosely off his dramatically thinned frame. The heavy black federal tracking monitor was still strapped securely around his ankle, serving as a constant physical reminder that he was effectively a prisoner out on temporary conditional bail. They were forced to sit right next to each other, but the hatred radiating between them was thick and venomous. They refused to even look in the same direction. When I took my seat directly across from them, they both physically shrank back into their metal chairs. The court-appointed mediator was a tired-looking man with thick glasses and a massive stack of complex financial documents arranged neatly in front of him. He cleared his throat and began to read the cold, hard facts of the case into the official legal record. He stated that we were gathered to formally mediate the massive catastrophic collapse of the Nevada shell companies and the resulting toxic mezzanine debt. He looked down at his calculator and read the final consolidated number aloud for everyone to hear. The total outstanding corporate liability, including the massive penalty interest rates, the foreclosure deficit on the marital mansion, and the unpaid commercial leases from the failed tech startup, came to exactly $4.2 million. The mediator then turned to the specific section regarding the registered creditors. He pushed his glasses up his nose and looked at the legal documents with a deeply confused expression. He stated that in his 30 years of overseeing complex commercial bankruptcy mediations, he had never seen a debt structure so perfectly and aggressively isolated. He informed Cynthia and Cameron that every single fractional penny of that massive $4.2 million debt was legally owed to one single corporate entity. That entity was the Vanguard Logistics Holdings Trust, based in Delaware. He then looked directly at me and formally recognized me for the legal record as the sole executive representative and primary beneficiary of that specific holding trust. Cynthia closed her eyes and let out a pathetic, whimpering sound that echoed in the sterile room. Cameron just stared at the laminated table with a completely hollow, defeated expression. They already knew they had been thoroughly outsmarted, but hearing a federal mediator officially confirm that they owed me over $4 million cemented their absolute permanent ruin. The mediator explained that under normal bankruptcy circumstances, individuals could simply liquidate their remaining assets and wipe the slate clean. But because this specific debt was intricately tied to gross corporate negligence and pending federal fraud investigations, the standard bankruptcy protection could be completely legally challenged and denied by the primary creditor. I raised my hand slightly, signaling my highly paid litigators to remain completely silent. I did not need lawyers to speak for me. I looked directly at the court-appointed mediator and politely asked him to step out of the room for exactly 5 minutes so I could offer a private settlement directly to the desperate debtors. The mediator nodded, gathered his pens, and quickly left the room, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. The silence in the room became incredibly suffocating. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out 2 perfectly identical thin manila folders. I placed them gently on the center of the table directly between Cynthia and Cameron. I did not raise my voice. I spoke to them with the exact same calm, professional tone I use when negotiating a bulk fuel contract for my delivery trucks. I told them that we had reached the absolute end of the road, and it was time to finalize the ultimate cost of their sickening betrayal. I tapped my index finger on the first folder. I explained that inside this folder was a formal binding legal petition drafted by my attorneys, The petition explicitly requested the federal bankruptcy court to completely deny their liquidation filing based on documented malicious corporate fraud. I told them that if I filed this petition, they would remain entirely responsible for the $4.2 million, but they would have absolutely no structured way to pay it back. Furthermore, I reminded them that the federal criminal prosecutors were currently waiting for my full cooperation as the primary victim of their massive tax forgery and wire fraud conspiracy. I stated clearly that if I chose to aggressively cooperate with the federal government, they would both be completely guaranteed to receive the maximum mandatory sentence of 10 years